What happens when unimaginable rudeness meets unexpected generosity? In the heart of a city that never sleeps, a young waitress struggling to make ends meet endures a storm of insults from a customer who seems determined to break her spirit. He thinks his wealth gives him the right to be cruel, to deny her even a single dollar for her hard work. But he's wrong. He has no idea that another man, a silent observer in the corner, is about to change her life forever. This isn't just a story about a tip. It's about the moment a titan of industry taught a bully a lesson and rewarded true grace with a gift that left an entire restaurant speechless. Stay with us. The Gilded Sparrow wasn't just a restaurant. It was a theater. Perched on the 65th floor of a gleaming skyscraper in Midtown Manhattan, its floor-to-ceiling windows offered a god's-eye view of the city's pulsing veins of light. The air inside hummed with the low thrum of discreet power, the clinking of heavy silverware on bespoke porcelain, and the murmur of conversations that could, and often did, shift markets and launch careers. Each table was a stage, each diner an actor in the grand play of New York society. And tonight, like every night for the past 8 months, Chloe Jensen was one of the silent stagehands, tasked with ensuring the performance ran without a flaw. At 22, Chloe wore the restaurant's uniform, a starched white shirt, a slim black tie, and a tailored black waistcoat, like a second skin. It was a costume of professionalism that hid the frayed edges of her own life. It hid the fact that her student loan debt was a ravenous beast, that the rent on her tiny Brooklyn apartment was 3 weeks overdue, and that her younger brother's college application fees were a looming specter in her thoughts. But here, amidst the scent of truffle oil and vintage Bordeaux, she was simply Chloe, a purveyor of seamless service, her smile as polished as the silverware she meticulously arranged. She moved with an economy of motion that bordered on balletic, her mind a complex switchboard of orders allergies and the subtle cues of her patrons. She knew which regulars preferred their water, with a slice of lemon versus lime, who was celebrating an anniversary and might appreciate a complimentary flute of champagne, and who was in the midst of a tense business negotiation and required minimal intrusion. Her perceptiveness was her greatest asset, the tool that usually earned her the generous tips she desperately needed to survive. Tonight, however, her finely tuned senses were screaming a warning. The source was table 12, a prime piece of real estate by the window currently occupied by a man whose presence seemed to suck the very warmth from the air around him. His name, she'd learned from the reservation, was Alistair Blackwood. He was a man in his late 50s, with a mane of silver hair swept back from a high, imperious forehead. His face was a mask of chiseled dissatisfaction, his eyes the color of a stormy sea, constantly scanning, judging, and dismissing everything they landed on. He wore a suit so exquisitely tailored it probably cost more than her entire year's tuition at NYU, where she was studying literature in her sparse, free time. He hadn't looked at her once, not truly. He'd looked through her as if she were a particularly uninteresting pane of glass. The ordeal had begun the moment he was seated. He'd waved away the host with a flick of his wrist, his displeasure at the table's placement, despite it being one of the most requested in the entire establishment, palpable. "Is this the best you can do?" He'd sneered, his voice a low, gravelly weapon. "I specified a corner table. This is merely by a window." "My apologies, Mr. Blackwood," the host, an unflappable man named Gregory, had said smoothly. "Our corner tables were reserved several weeks in advance. This table is considered to have one of our most panoramic views." Blackwood had merely grunted a sound of profound irritation and snatched the leather-bound menu from Gregory's hand. That was Chloe's cue. She approached with a pitcher of chilled water, her practiced smile firmly in place. "Good evening, sir. My name is Chloe, and I'll be taking care of you this evening. Can I start you off with some water?" He ignored the question, his gaze fixed on the menu. "Get me a bottle of the 98 Chateau Margaux, and make sure it's decanted properly. The last time I was in a place like this, the sommelier bruised the wine. I could taste his incompetence." Chloe's smile didn't waver, though a knot of anxiety tightened in her stomach. The 98 Margaux was a $4,000 bottle of wine. His casual demanding order was a clear signal. He was a man who used money as a bludgeon, expecting the world to cower. "An excellent choice, sir," she said, her voice even. "I will have our sommelier attend to it immediately." She retreated her steps, measured her heart thumping a nervous rhythm against her ribs. This was a test. Every interaction with a man like Alistair Blackwood was a test. One wrong move, one flicker of fear or frustration, and the fragile illusion of control would shatter, leaving her vulnerable to the full force of his contempt. And with it, any hope of a decent tip would evaporate. When she returned to take his food order, the hostility had metastasized. He'd dissected the menu with surgical cruelty, scoffing at the descriptions. Pan-seared foie gras, with a fig reduction. He read aloud, his lips curling. "How pedestrian! Has the chef run out of ideas? Is this a diner?" "Our chef Jean-Pierre is a James Beard Award winner, sir. The foie gras is one of our most celebrated dishes." Chloe recited the line she was trained to use a verbal shield against such attacks. Awards mean nothing. They're handed out like party favors to the creatively bankrupt, Blackwood retorted, slapping the menu shut. The sound echoed slightly in the refined quiet of the dining room. A few heads turned, their curiosity piqued by the breach in decorum. "Fine. I'll have the Dover sole, Meunier, and tell your award-winning chef that if it is even a fraction overcooked, I will be sending it back to his kitchen on a bed of his shattered reputation." He then turned his laser-like displeasure on her. "And you. What's your name again?" "Chloe, sir." "Chloe." He repeated the name as if it tasted foul. "Try to keep up. I expect my water glass to never be less than half full, but I don't want to see you hovering. It's a delicate balance. I trust you have the mental capacity to manage it." The insult was so direct, so personal, it felt like a physical slap. For a heartbeat, the mask slipped. Chloe's jaw tightened, and a flash of raw anger sparked in her eyes. She wanted to tell him that she was juggling a full course load, that she could analyze Chaucer and Shakespeare with a depth he couldn't possibly comprehend, that her mental capacity was the only thing keeping her afloat in a city designed to drown the unwary. But she couldn't. Instead, she took a slow, deliberate breath, forcing the anger down, burying it deep beneath layers of practiced servitude. She rebuilt her smile brick by painful brick. "Of course, sir. I understand completely." As she walked away from the table, the weight of his gaze felt like a physical object pressing between her shoulder blades. She could feel the eyes of other diners on her, now their expressions a mixture of pity and morbid curiosity. They were all part of the play, spectators to the public flogging of a waitress by a man who believed his net worth entitled him to be a monster. In a secluded, dimly lit booth in the far corner of the restaurant, another man watched the entire exchange. His name was Damien Sterling, and his presence in the Gilded Sparrow was an anomaly. Unlike Blackwood, He commanded attention not through noise and aggression, but through an aura of profound stillness. He was in his early 40s, dressed in a simple, dark grey cashmere sweater and tailored trousers that bespoke a quiet, confident wealth, far greater than Blackwood's ostentatious display. He hadn't come for the food, though it was exquisite. He had come for the memories. This had been his late wife Evelyn's favourite restaurant. They had celebrated their 10th anniversary in this very booth just 2 years ago before the swift and merciless illness had taken her. Tonight was the anniversary of her passing, and he had come to sit with her ghost, to feel her presence in the familiar elegance of the room. He had been lost in a melancholic reverie when the grating voice of Alistair Blackwood had pierced his bubble of grief. He recognized Blackwood, of course. Sterling's empire was in tech and sustainable energy, a world away from Blackwood's ruthless real estate development. But he knew the man by reputation, a corporate raider, a titan of hostile takeovers, a man who left a trail of ruined careers and broken companies in his wake. Seeing him in person, witnessing the casual cruelty he inflicted on the young waitress, confirmed every story he'd ever heard. He watched Chloe. He saw the flicker of her smile, the forced calm in her posture. But he also saw the tremor in her hand as she refilled a water glass at a neighboring table, the deep, weary shadow in her eyes when she thought no one was looking. He saw her spirit, a fragile but resilient flame, refusing to be extinguished by the bitter wind of Blackwood's scorn. And in that quiet, dignified resistance, he saw a glimmer of Evelyn. His Evelyn, who had faced her own final, terrible battle with a grace that had humbled him. The billionaire's gaze narrowed. His dinner, a simple plate of roasted chicken he'd barely touched, was forgotten. A new focus had entered his evening of remembrance. The theatre of the Gilded Sparrow had a new protagonist and a new villain. And Damien Sterling, a man who could move markets with a single phone call, decided he was no longer content to be a mere spectator. The play was about to have a new unscripted act. The next hour was a masterclass in psychological warfare with Alistair Blackwood as the undisputed general and Chloe as his sole beleaguered target. The restaurant hummed along a symphony of civilized enjoyment. But at table 12, a private, vicious war was being waged. Chloe delivered the decanted Chateau Margaux with the assistance of the sommelier, an older French gentleman named Luc. Blackwood watched Luc's every move with the intensity of a hawk. His eyes narrowed, searching for a flaw. Luc, a consummate professional, performed the ritual with practiced elegance, allowing the deep ruby liquid to cascade gently down the inner surface of the crystal decanter. "The temperature," Blackwood snapped before Luc could even offer a taste. "What is it?" "It is currently at 64 degrees Fahrenheit, Monsieur Blackwood, the ideal temperature to allow the tertiary aromas to express themselves fully." Luc explained, his voice a placid sea against Blackwood's rocky shore. Blackwood gestured impatiently for the glass. He swirled it once, twice, then thrust his nose deep into the bowl, inhaling with a theatrical display of concentration. He took a small, aggressive sip, sloshing the wine around his mouth as if it were mouthwash. He swallowed, his eyes closed for a dramatic beat. "It will suffice." He finally pronounced the words, a begrudging concession. He dismissed Luc with another flick of his wrist. "You, girl, pour it." The girl landed with calculated precision. He knew her name was Chloe. He had made a point of repeating it earlier. This was a deliberate act of depersonalization, another small cut designed to remind her of her station. Chloe picked up the heavy decanter, her hands steady, despite the adrenaline coursing through her. She poured a precise 5-ounce measure into his glass, stopping at the exact point where the bowl was at its widest. It was a perfect pour. He didn't acknowledge it. His appetizers arrived, a simple shrimp cocktail. He prodded the large, chilled shrimp with his fork. "These are from the Gulf, I presume?" he asked without looking up. "Yes, sir. Gulf white shrimp," Chloe confirmed. "I prefer Key West pinks. Their texture is superior." Did it not occur to anyone that a man ordering a $4,000 bottle of wine might have a more refined palate? He mused to himself loud enough for her and the adjacent tables to hear. He ate one shrimp, then pushed the plate away, leaving the other 5 untouched. "Mediocre," he declared to the room at large. Chloe cleared the plate, the waste of perfectly good food. A small sharp pain on top of everything else. That plate cost $60. $60 could have covered her electricity bill. She said nothing, her face a serene mask. Throughout the main course, the torment continued. The Dover sole, which the kitchen had prepared with painstaking care, was subjected to an intense interrogation. He flaked a piece with his fork, lifted it to the light, and examined it from every angle. "Is this parsley or chervil?" he demanded, pointing at a minuscule green fleck. "It's chervil, sir." Chloe answered, her knowledge of the menu absolute. "Chervil," he scoffed. "A lazy man's parsley. It lacks the peppery bite." He ate the fish. He ate every last bite of it, along with the accompanying haricots verts and potato purees. He cleaned the plate. Yet when Chloe returned, he leaned back, a smug look of triumph on his face. "As I predicted," he announced. "Overcooked. The edges were dry. I was tempted to send it back, but I am on a tight schedule and don't have time to wait for your chef to attempt it again, likely with even less success." The lie was so blatant, so audacious, that Chloe felt a moment of dizzying disbelief. The plate was spotless. He had practically polished it with his bread. Yet here he was, constructing an alternate reality where he was the victim of culinary incompetence. It was then she understood. This wasn't about the food, the wine, or the service. It was about power. It was about his need to be in control, to be superior, to diminish everyone and everything around him, to elevate himself. His water glass became a focal point of the abuse. If she refilled it when it was just under half full, he would glare and say, "I told you not to hover. Are you incapable of following simple instructions?" If she waited a moment longer, until it was just over half empty, he would tap the rim of the glass with his fingernail. A sharp, insistent click, click, click that drew stares from across the room. "Am I expected to die of thirst here?" he would ask, his voice dripping with sarcasm. She felt herself shrinking. With each passive-aggressive comment, each sneer and baseless complaint, a piece of her confidence chipped away. She started to second-guess her every move. Was she walking too quickly? Too slowly? Was her shadow falling across his table? The Gilded Sparrow, once a place of professional pride, began to feel like a prison, and Alistair Blackwood was her personal warden. She caught the eye of her manager, Gregory, who shot her a look of sympathetic encouragement. He knew what was happening. They had dealt with difficult customers before, but Blackwood was operating on a different level of malevolence. Gregory couldn't intervene directly unless Blackwood became overtly aggressive or used profane language. This slow, insidious cruelty was harder to police. To an outsider, it was just a demanding customer. To Chloe, it was an excruciating, slow-motion ordeal. From his corner booth, Damien Sterling missed nothing. He saw the untouched shrimp cocktail being carried away. He saw Blackwood devour his entire plate of soul before complaining about it. He saw the constant no-win game being played with the water glass. He saw the life draining from the young waitress's face, her professional smile becoming more and more brittle, like a pane of glass fracturing under pressure. He felt a cold, hard anger solidifying in his chest. It was an emotion he hadn't felt so intensely since Evelyn's diagnosis, that sense of rage against a cruel and senseless injustice. Blackwood wasn't just being rude. He was engaging in a form of sport. He was amusing himself by trying to break a person he saw as insignificant. Sterling's phone buzzed discreetly on the table. It was his head of security, a man named Marcus, with a pre-scheduled check-in call. Damien answered his voice low. "Everything all right, Mr. Sterling?" "I'm fine, Marcus," Damien said, his eyes still fixed on the drama unfolding across the room. "I have a question for you. Do you know anything about a real estate developer named Alistair Blackwood, Blackwood Holdings International?" There was a brief pause, the sound of quiet typing. "Yes, sir. I'm familiar with him. Reputation for being aggressive, leveraged to the hilt. There have been rumors circulating for the past few months that he's facing a significant liquidity crisis. One of his largest projects in Dubai stalled, and his creditors are getting nervous. He's been trying to secure a new line of credit, but the major banks have all turned him down." Damien's mind connected the dots with lightning speed. The aggression, the need to project power and control it, was the classic behavior of a desperate man, a wounded animal lashing out. Blackwood wasn't just a monster. He was a drowning monster trying to pull everyone else under with him. "Interesting," Damien murmured. "Marcus, I want you to do something for me. I'm going to send you a photo of a piece of jewelry. I want you to find out where I can acquire an identical piece. Tonight. I don't care about the cost. Have it delivered to the lobby of this building within the hour, and have a car ready." "Sir." Marcus's voice held a note of surprise. This was a highly unusual request. "You have the instructions, Marcus," Damien said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "I'll be in touch." He hung up. He looked at the single perfect rose in the small vase on his table, the same kind of rose he used to bring Evelyn every week. Then he looked back at Chloe. Her shoulders were slumped as she stood by a service station, her back to the dining room. Her head bowed for a fleeting second. She thought she was unobserved. In that moment of unguarded exhaustion, she looked impossibly young and terribly alone. Blackwood was now preparing for his final act. He had finished his meal. He had terrorized the staff. Now it was time for the final insult, the one that would serve as the grand finale of his performance. He was getting ready to pay the bill, and Chloe, steeling herself, knew the worst was yet to come. The moment Chloe placed the black leather bill folder on table 12, the atmosphere grew heavy, charged with a final malignant energy. Alistair Blackwood didn't open it immediately. He let it sit there, a silent testament to his power to make her wait. He took a final slow sip of his outrageously expensive wine, savoring the suspense he was creating. Chloe stood a respectful distance away, her hands clasped behind her back, her posture a study in forced neutrality. Inside her stomach was a roiling sea of acid. The bill was just over $4,600. A standard 20% tip would be more than $900. Even a bad 10% tip would be over $400. $400 would be a lifeline. It would cover her rent and the overdue electricity bill. It would mean she could eat something other than instant noodles for the next 2 weeks. Her entire being was focused on that single, desperate hope. She had endured his cruelty, absorbed his insults, and maintained her professionalism. Surely that had to be worth something. Finally, with a sigh of theatrical boredom, Blackwood opened the folder. He glanced at the total for no more than a second before pulling a sleek black credit card from his wallet. It was one of those exclusive invitation-only cards made of anodized titanium. He tossed it onto the folder. "Run it," he commanded. Chloe took the folder and walked to the point-of-sale terminal, her heart hammering against her ribs. This was it. The transaction was swift. She returned to the table, placing the folder back down with the credit card slip and a pen neatly laid on top. The folder now contained 2 copies of the slip, the merchant copy for him to sign, and the customer copy for him to keep. Crucially, there was a line on the merchant copy for him to add a tip and write in the new total. "Thank you, sir," she said, her voice barely a whisper. She started to turn away, as was customary to give him privacy. "Stay," he ordered. His voice was sharp, cutting. "I want you to watch." Chloe froze, her back half-turned. A cold dread, colder than any fear she had felt all evening, washed over her. She slowly turned back to face him. He wanted an audience for his final, cruel act. Blackwood picked up the pen. He looked directly at her, a malicious smirk playing on his lips. His eyes were gleaming with a kind of predatory delight. He made a great show of positioning the pen over the tip line. Chloe found she couldn't breathe. The entire restaurant seemed to fade into a dull, humming background. The only things that existed in the universe were her, this man, and the pen hovering over the receipt. With a deliberate, almost surgical flourish, he drew a thick black line through the space for the tip. He didn't just leave it blank. He actively, pointedly crossed it out. Then, in the space for the total, he rewrote the original amount, $4,627.50, with exaggerated precision. But he wasn't finished. He looked at her again, his smirk widening. He uncapped the pen, and on the memo line at the bottom of the slip, a space usually left blank, he began to write. He wrote 3 words, pressing down with such force that the ink bled slightly into the paper. "Learn your place." He capped the pen with a loud final click and pushed the folder toward her. "Take it," he said, his voice dripping with triumphant disdain. "And here's a little extra something for your trouble." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small handful of coins. Not dollars, coins. He tossed them onto the table. They scattered across the polished wood, a messy constellation of copper and silver. A few pennies, a nickel, a dime. Maybe 40 cents in total. The coins spun and clattered, the sound obscenely loud in the suddenly silent dining room. Time seemed to stop. The blood drained from Chloe's face, leaving her pale as parchment. It wasn't just about the money anymore. It was the calculated humiliation. The crossed-out tip line was an insult. The handwritten message was a branding. The tossed coins were a declaration that she was worth less than nothing. She was garbage, something to be discarded without a thought. A wave of hot, furious tears pricked the back of her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She would not give him the satisfaction of seeing her cry. She locked her jaw, her gaze fixed on the scattered coins. She saw the smirking faces of other diners reflected in the polished tabletop, their whispers a rising tide of shame. Her carefully constructed composure, the armor she had worn all night, shattered into a million pieces. She felt naked, exposed, and utterly broken. She couldn't move. She couldn't speak. Her mind was a white noise of rage and despair. All she could do was stand there, trembling as Alistair Blackwood pushed his chair back, stood up and adjusted his expensive suit. He gave her one last dismissive glance, a look that said, "I have crushed you," and then turned to leave his silver hair catching the light like a crown. From his corner booth, Damien Sterling felt a surge of pure, unadulterated fury. He had witnessed acts of corporate brutality, of ruthless negotiation and financial savagery. But this was different. This was personal. This was the gratuitous cruelty of a bully who needed to feel powerful by making someone else feel small. The sight of the scattered coins on the table, the girl's ashen face, the man's triumphant exit, it all coalesced into a single decisive moment of action. He had already received a text from Marcus. The package had arrived. Damien Sterling quietly placed a few $100 bills on his own table, more than enough to cover his untouched meal and a generous tip for the waiter who had served his section. He stood up, his movements fluid and silent. As Blackwood swaggered toward the exit, passing his booth, Damien stepped out, positioning himself directly in the man's path. Blackwood, lost in his self-satisfaction, nearly collided with him. He stopped short, his expression shifting from smugness to annoyance. "Watch where you're going," Blackwood snapped before looking up and getting a proper view of the man blocking his way. He didn't recognize Damien Sterling. To him, this was just another obstacle. "Alistair Blackwood," Damien said. His voice was quiet, almost conversational, yet it carried an unmistakable weight of authority that cut through the restaurant's ambient noise. The few people who had been whispering fell silent. Everyone, including Chloe, who was still frozen by her table, turned to look. Blackwood's eyes narrowed. "Do I know you?" "My name is Damien Sterling," he said simply. The name dropped into the room like a stone into a silent pond. Even a man as arrogant as Blackwood couldn't fail to recognize it. Damien Sterling was a legend, a reclusive titan whose wealth and influence dwarfed Blackwood's 100 times over. He was a kingmaker, a man who could build or destroy fortunes with a whim. Blackwood's arrogance instantly evaporated, replaced by a confused, fawning surprise. "Mr. Sterling, my apologies. I didn't recognize you. An honor, sir. A true honor." He stuck out his hand, a sycophantic smile plastered on his face. Damien ignored the outstretched hand. His gaze was cold hard and utterly unforgiving. "I watched your performance this evening, Mr. Blackwood," Damien said, his quiet voice reaching every corner of the now rapt restaurant. "Your thorough evaluation of the wine, your detailed critique of the culinary arts, and your final assessment of the service." He gestured with his head toward table 12, where Chloe still stood, a solitary, tragic figure, where the insulting receipt and the scattered coins still lay. Blackwood's smile faltered. A flush of red crept up his neck. "A small matter, Mr. Sterling. The service was subpar. I simply believe in providing direct feedback." "Direct feedback." Damien repeated the words, his voice laced with ice. "You believe your wealth gives you a license to humiliate a young woman who is working tirelessly to serve you. You believe it is your right to treat another human being as your personal plaything. You are mistaken." Every diner was now openly staring. The staff stood frozen in place. This was no longer just a confrontation. It was a public execution. "Now, if you'll excuse me," Damien said, his tone shifting from cold to dismissive, "I have something to attend to." He turned his back on the utterly flabbergasted Alistair Blackwood and began to walk not towards the exit, but directly towards Chloe. His steps were measured, purposeful. The entire restaurant held its breath. Chloe watched him approach her mind, unable to process what was happening. It was as if she were trapped in a bizarre, vivid dream. The most powerful man in the room, a man she had only ever read about in magazines, was walking toward her, and the bully who had tormented her all night was left standing speechless and humiliated in his wake. Damien Sterling stopped directly in front of Chloe. He was several inches taller than her, and for a moment she felt an instinct to shrink back, her nerves raw from the encounter with Blackwood. But there was nothing threatening in Damien's demeanor. His eyes, a deep and startlingly clear blue, held not judgment or pity, but a profound and gentle kindness that was so unexpected it almost brought her to her knees. He glanced down at the table at the offensive receipt and the pathetic scatter of coins. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Then he looked back at her. "What is your name?" he asked, his voice soft, intended only for her. "Chloe." She managed to whisper her own voice, sounding foreign to her ears. "Chloe Jensen." "Chloe." He repeated her name, not with scorn, but with respect. "I am so terribly sorry for what you were just forced to endure. No one under any circumstances deserves to be treated with such disrespect. Your grace and professionalism in the face of such profound ugliness were remarkable." Chloe could only stare, speechless. His words were a balm on a raw wound. To be seen to be validated after being made to feel so invisible and worthless, it was an overwhelming reversal of emotion. The tears she had fought so hard to contain now welled up, blurring her vision of the kind-faced man standing before her. She started, but no other words would come. Damien gave a small, understanding smile. He reached into the inner pocket of his jacket and produced a long, slender box covered in dark blue velvet. It looked expensive and felt anciently important in his hands. He held it out to her. "I believe this belongs to you," he said simply. Chloe looked from his face to the box and back again, her mind reeling in confusion. I don't understand." "Consider it a tip," he said, "for the service you provided tonight, not just to him," he nodded briefly in Blackwood's direction, "but for the dignity you showed. It was a lesson in character, and character should be rewarded." With trembling hands, Chloe took the velvet box. It was heavier than she expected, and the texture was soft beneath her fingertips. She fumbled with the clasp for a moment before it sprang open. Inside, nestled on a bed of white silk, lay a diamond necklace. It wasn't a subtle piece of jewelry. It was a statement. A cascade of brilliant cut diamonds was set in a delicate platinum chain, converging on a central pear-shaped diamond that seemed to capture and refract all the light in the room. It glowed with an internal fire, a dazzling, impossible star lying in the palm of her hands. It was the kind of jewel one saw in museums or on the red carpet at the Oscars. It was an object so far removed from her reality of overdue bills and instant noodles that it seemed to defy logic. A collective gasp swept through the restaurant. The whispers erupted into a low roar of astonishment. Chloe stared at the necklace, her heart pounding a frantic, syncopated rhythm. This couldn't be real. It was a dream, a hallucination, brought on by stress and humiliation. "I can't accept this," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. This is too much. It's worth a fortune." "It's worth precisely what it's intended to be," Damien replied, his voice still calm and steady amidst the rising hubbub. "A reminder that grace is more valuable than money, and that kindness is a currency that never loses its worth. Please, I insist." Meanwhile, Alistair Blackwood stood frozen near the entrance, his face a grotesque mask of shock fury and utter humiliation. He had been publicly dressed down and dismissed by Damien Sterling. And now, this same man was gifting a fortune in diamonds to the insignificant little waitress he had just taken such pleasure in tormenting. The scattered coins on his table seemed to mock him, a pathetic counterpoint to the literal treasure Chloe now held. His act of power had been turned into a pathetic petty joke. The entire room was now staring at him, not with the envy he craved, but with open contempt. He wanted to scream, to rage, to protest this cosmic injustice. But he couldn't. He was utterly neutered by the sheer scale of Damien Sterling's power. To lash out would be corporate suicide. To protest would make him look even more pathetic. With his face burning a deep mottled red, he turned on his heel and practically fled the restaurant, a defeated emperor, abandoning his own disastrous battlefield. Chloe looked up from the necklace, her eyes swimming with tears, and saw him go. She felt a strange, hollow pity for him for just a second, before the sheer, overwhelming reality of the moment crashed back down on her. "Why?" she asked Damien, the single word encompassing a universe of questions. "Why would you do this for me?" Damien's kind expression softened further, a hint of old sadness in his eyes. "My late wife, Evelyn," he began. His voice dropping even lower, she believed that the true measure of a person was how they treated those who could do nothing for them. She would have admired you tonight, Chloe. She would have been appalled by that man's behavior. He paused, looking at the necklace. "That design, it's a replica of one I gave her for our first anniversary. Seeing your strength reminded me of hers. Please wear it in good health, and perhaps use it to build a life where you never have to depend on the whims of cruel men for your survival." The personal nature of the revelation, the connection to his late wife, struck Chloe to her core. This wasn't a whim. It wasn't just a grand gesture. It was deeply personal. It was an act of remembrance, a tribute to a lost love channeled through an act of spontaneous, breathtaking generosity. The tears finally fell silent streams, tracing paths down her cheeks. But they were not tears of sadness or humiliation. They were tears of gratitude, of release, of a hope so vast and sudden it felt like the sun rising after a long and brutal night. "Thank you." She breathed the words, feeling utterly inadequate. "Thank you, Mr. Sterling." Gregory, the manager, finally approached, his face a mixture of awe and professional concern. "Mr. Sterling, is everything all right, Chloe? Are you okay?" Damien turned to him. "Everything is more than all right, Gregory. Chloe has just handled the most difficult customer I have ever had the misfortune to witness, and she has done so with a poise that does your establishment a great credit." He then reached into his wallet and pulled out a business card. He handed it to Chloe. "That's my personal assistant's number," he said. "If you decide that necklace is not to your taste, he can arrange for its sale through a discreet private broker. Or if you need advice on investments, tuition, anything at all, call him. Consider it a standing offer." He gave her one last, warm smile. Then, with a nod to the stunned manager, he turned and walked calmly towards the exit, his quiet departure as impactful as his dramatic intervention. The entire restaurant watched him go, a silent, collective awe hanging in the air. Chloe stood alone in the center of the storm's aftermath. In one hand, she held a business card that was a key to a different world. In the other, she held a velvet box containing a future she could never have imagined. On table 12, the pitiful coins and the hateful message on the receipt remained artifacts of a battle that had just been won in the most spectacular way possible. She looked down at the glittering diamonds, then out at the endless lights of New York City, and for the first time in a very long time, she felt like she could fly. The silence that followed Damien Sterling's departure was thick with disbelief. It was as if a bolt of lightning had struck the serene, climate-controlled atmosphere of the Gilded Sparrow, and everyone was still waiting for the thunder. Chloe stood motionless, the velvet box clutched in her hands like a sacred relic. Her colleagues, the other waiters and busboys, stared at her with wide, incredulous eyes. The diners moments before, engrossed in their own worlds of finance and romance, were now united in their focus on her, their whispers weaving a tapestry of shock and amazement. Gregory was the first to break the spell. He walked over to Chloe. His professional composure regained, though his eyes still shone with astonishment. He gently placed a hand on her shoulder. "Chloe, why don't you come with me?" he said softly. "Let's get you off the floor for a moment." He then turned to another waiter. "James, please clear and reset table 12. The instruction was both practical and symbolic. Erase the stain of Alistair Blackwood from the room. Chloe nodded numbly, allowing Gregory to guide her through the swinging doors into the controlled chaos of the kitchen. The moment she was out of the diner's sight, her composure crumbled completely. The velvet box slipped from her grasp, though she managed to catch it before it hit the floor. A great shuddering sob escaped her, a wave of pent-up emotion, so powerful it buckled her knees. She leaned against a stainless steel counter, the sounds of the kitchen, the sizzle of the grill, the clatter of pans, the sharp calls of the chefs fading into a distant buzz. She cried. She cried for the humiliation she had suffered, for the fear and anxiety that had been her constant companions for months. She cried for the bone-deep weariness of her struggle. And she cried for the sheer, overwhelming, impossible kindness of a stranger. Luc the sommelier appeared at her side with a glass of water. Jean-Pierre, the award-winning chef Blackwood had scorned, emerged from his office, his tall white hat slightly askew. He looked at Chloe's tear-streaked face and the velvet box she was now hugging to her chest. "I heard what happened," Jean-Pierre said, his French accent thick with emotion. "That man to cochon, he is filth. What you did, how you stood there. You have more class in your little finger than he has in his entire miserable life. And Monsieur Sterling, he is a good man, a true gentleman." The support of her colleagues enveloped her like a warm blanket. They had all witnessed her ordeal, had all felt a sliver of her pain. Now they shared in her astonishing vindication. After a few minutes, her sobs subsided into deep, ragged breaths. Gregory handed her a tissue. "Take the rest of the night off, Chloe. Go home. No one will expect you to work after this." She nodded, wiping her eyes. "Thank you, Gregory. Thank you all." Gathering her belongings from her locker was a surreal experience. She swapped her professional uniform for her simple jeans and t-shirt, the costume of her other life. But that life, the one defined by scarcity and worry, felt distant now. She carefully placed the velvet box and Damien Sterling's business card into her worn backpack. Their presence, a solid, tangible weight against the textbooks and notebooks that had until an hour ago represented her only path forward. The subway ride back to her Brooklyn apartment was a blur. She sat squeezed between a sleeping construction worker and a student listening to music. The secret treasure in her backpack, feeling like a pulsating heart. The grimy, screeching reality of the sea train was a world away from the diamond's pure, cold fire. Was it all a dream? Would she wake up in her tiny room to the sound of her alarm? the weight of her debt still crushing her. But when she got back to her small, tidy apartment and clicked on the lamp, the velvet box was still there. She opened it again under the dim yellow light. The diamonds seemed to drink the meager light and throw it back, magnified, filling her small room with a galaxy of impossible sparkles. It was real. She didn't sleep that night. She sat by her window looking out at the brick wall of the neighboring building, the necklace in its box on her lap. She thought about Damien Sterling and his late wife, Evelyn. She thought about the quiet dignity with which he had defended her, and the profound sadness that had colored his act of generosity. The necklace wasn't just a windfall, it was a legacy. It was a story of love loss and the enduring power of grace. The next morning, driven by a new and unfamiliar sense of purpose, she made a call. Not to Damien Sterling's assistant, not yet. She called her younger brother, Michael. "Hey, Mikey," she said, her voice clearer and stronger than it had been in months. "Chloe, you okay? You sound different." "I'm more than okay," she said, a smile spreading across her face. "Listen, don't worry about the application fees for Columbia, or the tuition, or anything. Just focus on your exams. I've got it covered." The stunned silence on the other end of the line was the first dividend her newfound fortune paid. The story, of course, did not end there. News of the incident at the Gilded Sparrow, fueled by the whispers of 24 of New York's most influential diners, spread like wordpulk through the city's elite circles. It became a cautionary tale in boardrooms and a piece of heartwarming gossip at charity galas. For Alistair Blackwood, the fallout was swift and catastrophic. His public humiliation at the hands of Damien Sterling was the final nail in the coffin of his teetering empire. The story painted him not as a powerful titan, but as a petty, cruel bully. Potential investors who had already been wary of his financial instability now saw a man with a fatal character flaw. The last line of credit he had been desperately negotiating for was abruptly pulled. Within 2 weeks, Blackwood Holdings International filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. The news reports mentioned his aggressive business practices and market downturns. But those in the know understood the real reason his empire had not been felled by market forces, but by a handful of scattered coins and a single, breathtaking act of kindness. A month later, after much soul-searching, Chloe made another call. She dialed the number on the business card. A polite, efficient voice answered. "Mr. Sterling's office. How may I help you?" "My name is Chloe Jensen," she said. "Mr. Sterling gave me this number. I'd like to sell the necklace." The decision hadn't been easy. The necklace was beautiful, a symbol of her vindication. But it was also a relic from another world, a world she didn't belong to. Its value wasn't in being worn, but in what it could create. As promised, the sale was handled discreetly and efficiently. The amount that was wired to the new bank account she opened was life-altering. It was enough to pay off her student loans, her brother's entire college education, and buy a small, comfortable condo for her and her mother, who had been living in a cramped rental upstate. But she didn't stop working at the Gilded Sparrow, not right away. She went back a week after the incident, her head held high. She wanted to prove to herself that she wasn't running away. She worked with a new confidence, a new poise. She no longer felt like a servant, but like a professional worthy of respect. The tips were better than ever, her colleagues treated her like a returning hero, and the story of Chloe's diamond became a piece of house lore. She finally left 6 months later on her own terms. She finished her literature degree, graduating summa cum laude. The last time anyone from the restaurant saw her, she was on her way to a meeting with a publisher. She had used the last of her diamond money as a seed fund to start a small independent press, one dedicated to discovering and publishing new authors, a place to give other people a voice. She never saw Damien Sterling again, but she sent him a single letter. It was a simple note of thanks, telling him what she had done with his gift. She included the first book her new press had published. She received no reply, but she didn't need one. His action had spoken for itself. It had been more than a gift. It had been a transfer of power. He had taken the ugliness of one man's hatred and transformed it into a legacy of hope, education, and creation. In the end, the most beautiful thing about the diamond necklace wasn't the stones themselves, but the future they had allowed to be built, a future as bright and as full of promise as the impossible star that had once lain in a velvet box. That night at the Gilded Sparrow, a simple act of service became a battleground for dignity. Chloe's story isn't just about the cruelty of one man or the incredible generosity of another. It's a powerful reminder that our true worth is measured by our character, not our bank account. In a world that often feels dark, a single act of kindness can ripple outwards, creating waves of change we might never see. Damien Sterling didn't just give a necklace. He invested in a person's spirit, and in doing so, he turned a moment of public humiliation into a legacy of hope and empowerment. If this story moved you, please take a moment to hit that like button and share it with someone who needs a reminder that good still exists in the world. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications for more true stories that will inspire and astonish you. Thank you for watching.